A man stands in front of stone that armies feared, the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. For 1,000 years they were the shield of the Western world. 3 layers of rock that swallowed sieges whole and sent kings home broken. But the Hungarian engineer standing before them did not see a monument. He did not see the last relic of Rome. He saw a flaw. He saw a customer. Orban carried a city's death inside his head, a formula of chemistry and fire waiting to be cast in bronze and sold to whoever paid the most. He was a merchant of ruin, and he had come to close a deal. Now listen, a sound no one alive had heard before. Not thunder, not an earthquake, something lower, something that flattened the air for miles and rattled the bedrock under the streets. This was the voice of the great cannon, the sound of ancient limestone turning to dust in a single roar. And it was born from one conversation months earlier when the man who dreamed up this weapon stood at these walls, named his price, and was sent away. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is remembered as the death of Rome itself. One age closing, another tearing open. But what sealed it? The hunger of a sultan barely 21 years old? Or one moment of imperial cheapness that cost a civilization everything? This is the story of how the strongest fortress on earth fell not to an army, but to an unpaid bill. How one rejected offer became a death sentence. Let us know which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe these stories must be told, take a moment to subscribe. It is the single best way to support this project. You're watching Romanus, your home of Roman Empire on YouTube. The winter of 1452 smelled of decay and incense. Orban walked through it, breathing in a city dying on its knees. He was no dreamer. He was a craftsman of a new craft, one that turned sand, sulfur, and charcoal not into gold, but into force. He understood a truth most men had not caught up to yet. The future would not belong to the sharpest sword or the tallest wall. It would belong to whoever could forge thunder and aim it. He sold explosions for a living, and he had come to Constantinople to make an offer. We do not know exactly where Orban was born. The chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles calls him a Hungarian. Dukas, who lived through the siege and wrote it down within a decade, names him a Dacian from beyond the Danube. Either way, he was a foreigner in a foreign war, a man with no flag and no faith beyond the ledger. Gunpowder had reached Europe barely a century before. Few men understood it. Fewer still could cast bronze thick enough to hold the blast without bursting. Orban was one of them. He had learned his trade in the Hungarian and German lands, where cannon founders were rarer than gold and paid like princes. The city he entered wore the skin of an empire over hollow bones. The great forums had become empty fields. Vines climbed the columns where senators once argued. The aqueducts sat cracked and dry. Marble palaces stood abandoned, their windows staring out like the sockets of a skull. Travelers who came to Constantinople in these years described whole districts inside the walls turned back to farmland, orchards, and gardens, growing where crowds once packed the streets. A city built for 1 million people now held fewer than 50,000. 10,000 relics. Not enough bread. He walked past the hippodrome, its stone tiers silent, its bronze horses long since carried off to Venice after the Latins sacked the city in 1204. That wound had never healed. Constantinople had been looted once already by fellow Christians, and it had limped ever since. The Church of the Holy Apostles, where emperors had been buried for centuries, stood half-empty. In the great church of Hagia Sophia, the lamps still burned, but the congregation had thinned to a stubborn few who refused to enter it at all, because they believed the union with Rome had defiled it. Monks stood in the streets and shouted that God would sooner see the city burn than bow to the Pope. He walked through a museum waiting for its last exhibit to arrive. He carried a cure in his head, or an execution. The price would decide which. They received him in the Blachinae Palace, pressed against the northern walls above the Golden Horn. The old imperial residence, the great palace by the sea, had been abandoned generations earlier, too vast and too costly to keep. So the last emperors crowded into Blachinae. The throne room had once dazzled. Now a film of dust covered the mosaics of triumphant emperors, their golden halos chipped and gray. Cold air rolled in off the water. Somewhere below, the timber of Venetian and Genoese galleys creaked at anchor. On the throne sat Constantine XV Palaiologos, the last man who would ever carry the title of Roman emperor. He was crowned in 1449, far away in Mistra, in the Peloponnese, not in the Hagia Sophia. There was a reason for that. The church was split. Constantine had accepted union with Rome in 1439 at the Council of Florence to win Western aid, and half his own clergy hated him for it. One admiral of his own fleet, Lucas Notaras, was remembered for a line that captured the mood of the city. He would rather see the Sultan's turban in Constantinople, he said, than the Latin mitre. That was the empire Orban walked into, a city that could not agree on how to pray, let alone how to survive. Constantine was no coward. He had spent his best years fighting in the Morea, rebuilding the hexamillion wall across the isthmus at Corinth to hold back the Turks. It had failed. Murad II smashed through it in 1446 and carried off thousands as slaves. Constantine knew, better than any man in that hall, what the Ottomans did to a city that fell. He was a soldier and a realist, cornered by the failures of dead men. His empire had shrunk to this one city, a few scattered islands, and a strip of Greek coast around Mistra. Even the money in his vaults was not truly his. Much of it had been left in trust by monasteries and merchants, and he could not spend it without answering to men who would sooner lose the city than their coin. His treasury was a stack of promises. He wore the purple of the Caesars and ruled a beautiful tomb. Into that silence, Orban spoke of fire. He did not lower his voice. He spoke like a man holding tomorrow in his hand. He laid it out with an engineer's calm. He could build a weapon, a tube of cast bronze that would hurl a stone ball weighing hundreds of pounds across more than a mile. It would not chip at the Theodosian walls the way old siege engines did. It would punch through them, and those walls deserved their reputation. Emperor Theodosius II raised them in the 5th century, when he was still a boy, and his praetorian prefect Anthemius ran the state. They were finished around AD 413. Then an earthquake shattered them in AD 447, with Attila and his Huns closing in from the west. The city rebuilt the whole line in about 2 months. Factions in the Hippodrome, the Blues and the Greens, who normally fought each other in the stands, hauled stone side by side. 3 lines of defense, an outer wall, an inner wall rising 60 feet, and a moat that could be flooded. For 1,000 years, no army had broken through them by force. The Avars had failed. The Arabs had failed, twice, once for years, their fleet burned to the waterline by Greek fire. The Rus had failed. The Bulgars had failed. Orban was promising to end that record with a single machine. Then he named his price. The room went quiet. The figure was not merely high. It was impossible. Enough gold to pay the city's entire garrison for a year. Constantine looked to his advisors. worried faces above empty purses. They shook their heads. They murmured in the cold hall about copper they did not have, tin they could not find, raw material no one could gather, let alone the master's fee on top of it all. The emperor listened. Every instinct told him this weapon mattered. He could almost feel the ground shudder under his feet. But he could not spin gold from air. His records show how deep the rot ran. When the siege finally came, his chancellor, George Francis, was ordered to make a secret census of every man who could hold a weapon. The count came back below 8,000, and Constantine begged him to keep it hidden, because the truth would break what little courage the city had left. Many of those defenders were foreigners, paid in coin the treasury barely had. The bell that should have summoned a great empire's army rang over a garrison the size of a town watch. So he tried to bargain. He offered Orban less, a modest wage, a post in his service, a fraction of the sum. He was haggling with the man selling him the end of the world. Orban's face stayed flat. He had seen this before. The polite excuses of powers already in the grave. He turned down the counteroffer without heat. Ducas records that the city could not even keep him fed on what it offered. The audience ended, and in that moment, Constantine the refund, the 148th Roman emperor since Augustus, made the worst decision of his reign. He looked at the cost of survival and decided he could not pay it. He kept his few gold coins. He signed away his world. Orban did not linger. He gathered his things and walked out through gates he already knew he would help tear down. This was not defeat. It was a change of buyer. He took a small boat across the Bosphorus. The crossing lasted less than an hour. It carried him between two ages of the world. Behind him, Constantinople, the last echo of Rome, clutching its past. Ahead of him, the future itself, spread across the far shore as a sea of tents, horses, and armed men, humming with ambition. This was the Ottoman war machine. And at its center sat a sultan of 21, who thought of almost nothing but the city Orban had just left. His name was Mehmed II. He had taken the throne 2 years earlier, in 1451, after the death of his father Murad II. His first reign, as a boy, had gone badly. The old guard did not trust him. A grand vizier named Halil Pasha had once dismissed him and called his father back to rule. Mehmed did not forget. He came back to power older, colder, and done being underestimated. One of his first acts as sultan tells you everything. His father had left an infant half-brother. Mehmed had the child drowned in his bath, then executed the man who did it to keep the appearance of clean hands. He read and spoke several languages: Turkish, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and had Latin and Slavic texts read to him. He kept Alexander close. Arrian's account of the Macedonians' campaigns was read aloud to him at night. He did not see Constantinople as a sacred thing to protect. He saw it as the one obstacle between himself and greatness. The jewel his crown lacked. The heart of the empire he meant to build. And he would pay anything to have it. Even before Orban arrived, Mehmed had shown his hand. In the summer of 1452, he built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, directly across from an older Ottoman fort his great-grandfather had raised. Rumeli Hisar, the Europeans called it the throat cutter, because it choked off the strait. Mehmed drew the plans himself, set thousands of masons to work, and assigned each of his viziers a tower to finish under his own name, so none dared fall behind. It went up in under 5 months. Its walls ran 22 feet thick. He mounted heavy guns at the waterline. Now no ship could reach Constantinople from the Black Sea without Mehmed's permission. when a Venetian captain named Antonio Rizzo tried to run past it that November. The fortress guns caught his ship in the current and sank it. Rizzo was captured and impaled on a stake by the roadside. His crew were beheaded, and their bodies left unburied as a warning to every sailor who passed. The blockade was already killing the city before Orban's cannon fired a single shot. When word of the killings reached Constantinople, Constantine sent envoys to protest. Mehmed had them imprisoned. A second embassy he had beheaded outright. The message was plain. There would be no more talking. Orban sold his loyalty to the highest bidder. But some loyalties are not for sale. They are sworn. That is what our inner circle, the Praetorian Guard, is all about. It is for the viewers who believe these stories must be told with the quality and intensity they deserve. By joining the Guard, you are not just a spectator. You stand watch with us, making sure the history of Rome is never forgotten and never softened. You are the elite unit that keeps this channel alive. In return for your service, you get exclusive access to videos before anyone else. If you are truly loyal to the mission of this channel, then it is time to take your post. Click the Join button and enlist in the Praetorian Guard. The second meeting looked nothing like the first. No dusty throne room, no faded halos. Mehmed received the engineer in his court at Edirne, the Ottoman capital in Thrace, surrounded by maps and dispatches and the steady noise of a state getting ready for war. The air carried leather and steel, not incense and rot. The Sultan was young, with eyes that seemed to burn through whoever stood before them. Those close to him described a man of long silences, quick to reward and quicker to punish, who paced his rooms at night sketching the walls of a city he had never breached. One story claims he woke Halil Pasha in the dark and demanded the whole city, unwilling to wait for morning. He did not ask about Orban's travels. He did not plead poverty. He asked one thing, sharp as a knife. Could Orban build a cannon big enough to break the walls of Constantinople? For the first time, Orban let himself smile. A small, cold smile. He had found his customer. His answer has carried down through the centuries, recorded by Ducas. "I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity of the stone you want," he said, his voice level. "I have examined the walls of the city in detail. I can shatter to dust not only these walls with the stones from my engine, but the very walls of Babylon itself." Something lit in Mehmed's face, close to worship. He was watching his destiny handed to him across a court floor. He gave Orban everything. No budget limit. A workforce of laborers. Every foundry, every mine, every scrap of metal in his growing empire. He paid the engineers outrageous price without a blink, then doubled it again. The sources say he offered Orban 4 times what the man had asked. The deal was sealed. The end of Rome had been commissioned. Orban began at once. Ducas records that within 3 months he cast a first cannon, and Mehmed sent it to guard Rumeli Hisar. That was the gun that sank Rizzo's ship. But it was only a test piece. The Sultan wanted more. He asked Orban if he could build something twice the size. The engineer said he could. So the great foundry rose at Edirne. The furnaces ran for days. Workers built a mold from clay strengthened with iron and hemp, then sank it upright in a pit dug into the earth. When the metal was ready, they broke the furnace plugs, and molten bronze poured down into the mold in a river of orange light, the heat turning the winter air to shimmer and driving the workers back with their arms across their faces. It cooled for days before they dared break the clay away. What came out was a thing no army had ever dragged to a wall. The barrel ran close to 27 feet long. Its bronze was over 3 feet thick at the breech. The bore was wide enough for a man to climb inside. It could throw a stone ball weighing over half a ton. When they finished, they packed the chamber with powder, aimed it across the empty plain, and sent criers through Edirne the day before, warning the townspeople and telling pregnant women to guard themselves against the shock. Then they lit it. The roar rolled for miles. Ducas wrote that the ground trembled, and the sound was heard for 100 stadia. The ball vanished into the horizon and buried itself 6 feet into the earth a mile away. Men who watched fell to their knees. Mehmed had his weapon. Now he only had to bring it to the walls. It could not be moved like other guns. 60 oxen would drag it on a special carriage. 200 men would walk beside it to hold it steady on the slopes. A crew of engineers went ahead, leveling the road and reinforcing every bridge along the 140 miles from Edirne to the city, because the ordinary crossings would collapse beneath its weight. It crept forward at a walking pace, weeks on the road, a monster inching toward its target. Across the water, Constantine's watchmen would soon send word of the thing grinding west out of Thrace, of the oxen and the dust, and the great bronze barrel gleaming in the pale sun. And the emperor, who had refused to buy that cannon, was about to learn, stone by falling stone, exactly what his savings had cost him. 3 months later, in Edirne, the Ottoman capital in Thrace, Orban was building a small city that existed only to make one thing. Mehmed had given him a foundry. What he had really given him was a factory of fire. Hundreds of workers labored through the day and into the night under Orban's eye. Furnaces taller than houses roared without pause, their mouths glowing until the air above them bent and swam. They swallowed whole forests for fuel. They ate copper and tin hauled by cart from mines across Anatolia. The Sultan had ordered church bells melted down where he could reach them, and old coins fed into the crucibles for their metal. The ground turned black with soot and spilled bronze. The air hung thick with smoke that scoured the lungs and left men's eyes streaming. The noise never stopped. Hammers on anvils, cranes groaning under their loads, foremen shouting over the low, endless roar of the furnaces as they turned metal to liquid. This was not the slow patience of a lone craftsman at his bench. This was the making of a weapon on a scale the world had not seen. An engine built to erase. Orban was not making one gun. Ottoman accounts speak of a whole park of artillery pouring out of Edirne that winter, dozens of pieces, arranged later into 14 or 15 batteries along the walls. But the Basilic stood above them all. Around it, smaller bombards took shape in their own pits, so that the foundry never went cold. The work ran on a rhythm of fire and cooling, week after week. Powder came in too, ton after ton of it, mixed on the spot from saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, stored in barrels far from the flames because one stray spark could end the whole enterprise. Casting the great gun was an event in itself. Workers dug a trench into the earth, longer than any galley in the Sultan's fleet. Inside it, they built a mold of clay, bound with iron and hemp, an exact hollow shell of the beast to come. A core ran down the center to leave the bore, and it had to sit perfectly straight, or the finished barrel would fire crooked and burst. Channels ran off the mold to guide the metal. Reservoirs waited to hold tons of molten bronze. When the day arrived, Orban ran the operation like a priest of some machine religion. Men wrapped in wet cloth against the heat broke open the furnace plugs with iron bars. The bronze came out white and fluid as water, pouring down the channels in a blinding stream, filling the mold buried in the ground. Sparks leapt where it splashed. The reek of hot metal and burnt clay hung over everything. For a moment, the earth itself seemed to boil. Then came the worst part, the waiting. The casting had to cool at a controlled pace over several days. Too fast, and the metal would crack, ruining the whole gun and a fortune in bronze with it. Too slow, and hidden flaws could form deep in the walls, the kind that would later split a barrel and kill the men who fired it. Guards stood around the cooling pit, not only to protect it, but to listen. They were listening for one sound, the sharp crack of a fissure that would mean everything was lost. For 3 days, silence. When they finally dug the earth away and lifted the barrel free with oxen and chains, the thing that rose from the pit was more than a weapon. It was a declaration. They called it the Basilic, the royal one. The barrel ran over 27 feet. Its walls were 8 inches of solid cast bronze, thick enough to hold forces no gun had held before. The muzzle measured 30 inches across, wide enough to swallow a crouching man. It fired a single carved stone ball weighing more than 1,200 pounds. Some accounts push that closer to 1,500. Not iron, not lead, a piece of a mountain, shaped into a sphere, thrown with enough force to cross a mile and strike a wall like a falling star. The balls themselves were cut from black limestone quarried on the Black Sea coast, shaped by masons and greased before loading. The gun itself weighed close to 19 tons. This was not the next step in artillery. The bombards of the age were crude and unreliable, as likely to burst as to fire. The Basilic was something else, a superweapon dropped into an age of swords and shields. It made every fortress on Earth suddenly old. The age of high walls was ending. The age of gunpowder had come. Only Orban's knowledge stood between the Sultan and failure, and Mehmed treated him accordingly, keeping him close and richly kept. Dukas wrote that Mehmed doubted his own eyes, and made Orban swear the walls could not withstand it. Then a new problem arrived. How do you move 19 tons of bronze 140 miles across the hills of Thrace? The road from Edirne to the front before Constantinople became a feat of engineering in itself. This was no supply train. It was a funeral march for the city of Constantine, and it moved in plain sight. They built a carriage from massive timbers resting on rollers, the wood groaning under the load. 60 oxen were yoked at the front, their backs straining to drag the dead weight a few hundred yards before they had to stop and rest. 200 men walked beside the gun, their only task to keep it upright on the slopes, heaving on ropes when a wheel sank into soft ground. They laid wooden planks in front of the rollers, then ran to pull them up from behind and carry them forward again, building a moving road as they went. Another 200 men marched ahead as pioneers. They flattened rises, they filled ditches, they threw up wooden bridges over streams and gullies strong enough for a single crossing, then torn down behind. The column crawled, 2.5 miles on a good day. The ground shivered when it passed. Villagers came out of their doors and stood in silence, watching the bronze thing drag toward their old capital. It was a weapon of the mind long before it fired. A promise, inching across the land, of what was coming. It took the better part of 2 months to finish a journey a rider could make in 3 days. While the gun crept west, the rest of Mehmed's army was already gathering before the walls. The main force reached the plain outside Constantinople on the 6th of April, 1453. Contemporaries counted the tents by the tens of thousands, an army that dwarfed the city's defenders many times over. Modern estimates put Mehmed's men somewhere above 80,000, against fewer than 8,000 behind the walls. Among the Sultan's troops marched the Janissaries, his elite infantry, boys taken from Christian villages as children, raised in the faith of their master, loyal to no family but him. Their camp stretched from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, a line of fire and smoke that ringed the land walls end to end. At night, the defenders looked out on a field of campfires so wide it seemed the stars had fallen to earth. Barbaro wrote that the Turks lit so many bonfires that the sea itself seemed to burn. Mehmed did not rely on the guns alone. He had gathered miners from the Serbian silver mines to dig tunnels beneath the walls, and siege towers on wheels, and thousands of scaling ladders. He had a fleet, too, more than 100 ships, sitting in the Bosphorus. But the Basilic was the heart of it. Everything else was there to finish what the great gun began. Then, in early April, it came into view. From the top of the Theodosian walls, the defenders and their Genoese allies watched it hauled slowly into place. They had heard the rumors, talk of a great gun forged for the Sultan, but no rumor had prepared them for the sight of it out on the plain. It was the very weapon their emperor had been offered, the salvation he had been forced to turn away for lack of gold. Now it sat less than a mile off, aimed at the middle of the land walls, at the Mesotakion, the low ground where the wall dipped to follow the Lycus stream. That was the weakest stretch of the whole line. Mehmed knew it. He set the Basilic there and pitched his own scarlet and gold tent close behind it, with his horsetail standards planted in the dirt before it. The men holding that section were led by a Genoese soldier named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo. He had sailed into the doomed city in January with 700 fighting men and 2 ships at his own expense, when every other power in the West sent only prayers. Constantine made him commander of the land defense and promised him the island of Lemnos if the city held. He was a professional in a city of amateurs, and the defenders trusted him more than they trusted their own nobles. Beside him fought Venetians under their leader Girolamo Minato, and even a band of Turks under a rival prince, Orhan, who knew that if the city fell, Mehmed would have his head. Sappers, archers, and gunners all took their posts along the 4 miles of wall, each nation to its own stretch. The dread hit at once. This was not only an enemy machine, it was the shape of the city's own failure. A demon born from its poverty and the Sultan's endless coin. The defenders were not just facing an army. They were facing the proof of a mistake no one could take back. For days they watched Ottoman engineers raise an earthen bank to cradle the gun and set it with careful measurement. They watched crews hoist the great stone balls into position. They watched powder measured out by weight. They were watching their own execution laid out with the calm of an arithmetic problem. Loading the Basilic was a ritual of death that took close to 3 hours for 1 shot. The barrel was swabbed clean. Nearly 200 pounds of black powder was measured and rammed down the bore. Then, the stone. Using ropes, pulleys, and wooden cranes, a crew winched the marble sphere up to the muzzle, eased it inside, and wedged it tight against the charge with thick wooden plugs. Every motion was slow and deliberate. Between shots, crews poured oil over the barrel and packed it with wet wool to draw off the heat, because bronze fired hot too often would crack down its length. For the men on the wall, this was its own torment. They stood in silence for hours and watched the instrument of their doom being made ready, and they could do nothing. Their own guns were nearly useless against it. The recoil of their heavier pieces shook the old walls and loosened the very stones they were meant to defend, so the defenders were forced to fire them sparingly or not at all. Their range fell short of the Ottoman lines. So they waited. They watched. And they prayed. Inside the city, the churches never emptied. Priests carried the icon of the Virgin, the Hodegetria, through the streets on the shoulders of the faithful. Men who had spent years quarreling over the union with Rome now knelt together, because the canon did not care which liturgy a man preferred. Lucas Notarus, the same admiral who had sneered at the Latin mitre, now stood on the walls beside the men he had scorned. George Francis, the emperor's chancellor, moved among the defenders and later wrote down what he saw with the plain grief of a man recording the end of his world. A Venetian ship's doctor named Niccolo Barbaro kept a diary in the harbor, marking down each day of the siege, and it survives to tell the hours. Cardinal Isidore, sent from Rome, had brought 200 archers and money to repair the walls, and he manned a stretch of them himself. On the morning of April 12, 1453, the work was done. The gun was loaded. The aim was set. Orban gave the final word. A man carrying a long fuse walked toward the touch-hole at the rear of the barrel. The moment had come. The knowledge behind a weapon like this, the grasp of chemistry and metal and force, is a kind of power. The stories on this channel rest on that same foundation of deep research. The book that served as the primary source for this script is a masterwork of imperial history, an archive of this whole savage world. You can find it right now, along with a curated set of other imperial treasures, by clicking the View Products button on your screen. This book was the bedrock of today's story, and if you want to truly grasp what happened here, you should own it. But there is more. We have gathered other relics of Rome to sit beside it. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Browse the collection now while the story runs on. See what is waiting to complete your library. The fuse caught. A hiss of sparks ran toward the breach. Then the world broke. The blast was not a sound. It was an event. A flash of white erupted from the muzzle, and a wall of pressure flattened every man standing too close. The roar carried for miles across the Marmara and up the hills of the far shore. Barbaro wrote that the noise seemed to come from the pit of the earth. Accounts from the time claim it brought on miscarriages among women inside the city. The ground jumped as in an earthquake. The gun, all 19 tons of it, threw itself backward, its carriage splintering under the recoil, and a cloud of yellow smoke swallowed the battery whole. Birds burst from the trees for half a mile around, and in the sky, the stone flew, a black speck arcing toward the city. It hung there for what felt like a lifetime. Then it struck the wall near the gate of St. Romanus. It did not bounce. It did not chip the stone. It hit like something fallen from the heavens. 1,000 years of Roman engineering, a barrier that had thrown back army after army, came apart. A stretch of rampart vanished into a cloud of white dust and broken limestone. The sound of it reached the defenders a heartbeat after the sight, a deep crack rolling back off the inner wall. When the smoke thinned, the men on the wall stared without a word. For 1,000 years, these had been the shield of a city men called God protected. They had seemed as permanent as the sea, as fixed as the hills. They had held against the Avars in AD 626, against 2 Arab sieges, against Bulgars and Rus and Latins. Now there was a hole, a raw wound torn into the stone they had trusted with their lives. But the gun had a flaw, and the defenders would soon learn to pray for it. It could fire only a handful of times a day, 7 or 8 at most. It took hours to cool, hours to load, and the strain on the bronze grew with every shot. Between the roars, the defenders rushed into the breach with earth, timber, brushwood, and barrels of packed soil, women and children carrying baskets through the night to rebuild by dark what the Basilic tore down by day. They hung sheets of leather and bales of wool over the fresh repairs to soften the next impact. For weeks, the siege became a race, the stone against the shovel, the furnace against the human hand. And Orban, the man who had sold this monster to the Sultan after his own price was refused, stood in his battery and watched his creation work exactly as he had promised. The walls of Babylon itself, he had boasted, and here was the wall of Constantine coming apart before his eyes. He did not yet know that the gun he had built to end a city would also come for him. That first shot set a rhythm, a slow, cruel one. The Basilic and the smaller bombards beside it could only fire a handful of times a day. Swabbing the barrel, packing the powder, winching the next stone into place, it all took hours, and that delay did more damage to the mind than any steady barrage could. First came the roar and the impact, one instant of destruction that shook the city to its roots. Then, silence. An unnatural quiet settling over the plain. In that silence, the real ordeal began. The defenders crawled out from cover, ears ringing, hands shaking, and ran to the fresh breach. There were no master masons waiting, no time for careful work. They fought the ruin with whatever they could carry. They piled broken limestone. They rolled barrels of packed earth into the gap. They drove wooden stakes into the rubble and lashed brushwood across it. Barbaro, the Venetian doctor keeping his diary in the harbor, wrote that they stuffed the gaps with anything they could find, even bales of wool and rolls of leather to soak up the next blow. They stacked debris with bare hands until their fingers split on the stone. Women and children carried baskets of earth up to the wall through the night. They worked like people possessed, because every quiet second was a second nearer the next blast. This was the true shape of the fight, not sword against sword, shovel against furnace. A few dozen exhausted men trying to close a wound before a machine a mile away could tear it open again and take them with it. For 6 weeks, the pattern held. The Ottoman gunners did not fire at random. They struck the same spot with cold patience, the middle of the land walls near the Lycus, at the gate of St. Romanus, and the low ground beside it. They learned a technique too, firing 3 shots in a triangle, 2 low and 1 high, so the wall above would collapse into the 2 holes below. The Basilic did not merely breach the walls. It ate them. The outer wall was hammered into a low mound of dust and rubble. The inner wall, 15 feet thick, the pride of Theodosius, was ground down. What had been 3 lines of defense, moat and low wall and high rampart, became a single sloping ramp of loose stone, a gravel road leading straight into the city. How do you hold a line built of gravel? How do you fight an enemy who can turn your shield into the ramp he climbs to reach your throat? Morale had run high in the first days. Now it drained away with the limestone. The defenders went sleepless and half-starved, the sea blockade choking off supply. Their own guns were few and small, and their range fell short. Worse, when they did fire the larger pieces, the recoil cracked the old ramparts under their feet. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and they knew it. The boom of the great cannon became the bell tolling for their world, each note announcing that another stretch of wall, another piece of hope, had turned to powder. There were small mercies. On April 20th, 3 Genoese ships and a Byzantine grain vessel fought their way through the entire Ottoman fleet and reached the harbor, in full view of both armies, their crews hurling stones and pouring fire down onto the smaller Turkish boats that swarmed them. Mehmed rode his horse into the sea in his fury, shouting at his admiral, and had the man stripped of rank and beaten with a golden rod. For one day, the city believed help was coming from the west. It never did. The Pope's promises and the ships of Venice came too late or not at all. The signs, men said, turned against them. On the 24th of May, the moon rose in eclipse, and an old prophecy had held that the city would never fall while the moon waxed full. Days later, during a procession, the holiest icon of the Virgin slipped from its bearers and fell in the mud, and the men who tried to lift it found it heavy as lead. Then a storm broke, hail and rain flooding the streets so that water ran waist-deep through the lanes, and a fog rolled in thick and out of season. When it lifted, watchers swore a strange light played over the dome of the Hagia Sophia. To the Greeks, it looked like the glory of God leaving the church. To Mehmed's camp, it looked like a sign the city was theirs. Even the Sultan's advisors grew uneasy at it, until his own scholars read it in his favor, and the man behind the guns moved among his engines with the pride of a master. Orban checked the powder loads. He ran his hands over the barrels, feeling for the hairline cracks that spelled disaster. He set the angles for the next shot. He was the most important man in the camp after the Sultan himself. He had forged the key to the greatest city in the world, and he was being paid in gold beyond counting. But the forces he had loosed were young and wild and unstable. Casting bronze on this scale was closer to sorcery than science. A flaw could hide deep in the metal, invisible, waiting. Every shot drove a shockwave through the barrel and pushed the bronze to its limit. The great gun had already begun to fail him. Within days of its first firing, cracks opened along the barrel, and Orban tried binding it with iron hoops and packing warm oil into the seams to keep the metal from splitting in the cold. He slowed its rate of fire to save it. He knew the danger. He pushed his creations anyway. Then the weapon collected its debt. Sometime during the siege, one of the largest bombards stood ready to fire. Orban was close by, calling out to the crew. The fuse burned down. The gun did not fire forward. It burst at the breech. A hidden flaw in the casting gave way, and tons of bronze tore itself apart with the powder behind it. The blast threw fire and jagged metal backward into the Ottoman lines and scythed through the men working the gun. Orban, who had promised to shatter the walls of Babylon, was killed where he stood, torn apart by the thing he had made. The engineer who had sold a city its death was paid back in his own coin. The engineer was gone. His monster was not. The great gun kept firing without him, tended now by other hands. By the end of May, the walls were a corpse. The gate of St. Romanus was no longer a gate, but a wide gap in the city's side. The moat had filled with rubble until it made a smooth causeway an army could walk across. Mehmed knew the hour had come. He had also solved his one great problem. Unable to break the great iron chain that sealed the mouth of the Golden Horn, he had dragged some 70 of his ships overland on greased wooden rollers across the hills behind Galata and slid them into the harbor from behind. It took a single night. Men hauled on ropes while pipers and drummers set the rhythm, and the ships seemed to sail over dry land in the dark. When the defenders woke, an enemy fleet floated in waters they had thought safe. A Venetian plan to burn those ships ended in failure days later, and 40 captured sailors were impaled in sight of the walls. The defenders answered by beheading their Turkish prisoners on the ramparts where the enemy could watch. Now the city had to man the sea walls too, and there were no men to spare. The trap had closed on every side. For weeks, the cannon had bled the city, breaking its body and its will. Now came the blow to the heart. On the night of May 28th, Mehmed ordered the whole army to make ready for a final assault. He had promised his men the ancient right of 3 days of plunder, the reward for a city taken by storm. He rode the length of the camp on his horse, past the tents and the fires, telling them the treasures and the people of the city were theirs. Only the walls and the buildings belonged to him. Campfires ringed Constantinople in a wall of flame that turned the night sky the color of a forge, and the defenders heard the enemy calling out to God in a single voice that rolled across the plain and echoed off the ruined stone. Then the fires went dark and the camp fell silent, and the silence was worse than the noise. Inside the walls, the bells rang, not in joy, but as a last call. Constantine XXIII rode through the streets that night on his mare, checking the gates were barred behind the defenders so no man could flee. Then he gathered what remained of his people in the Hagia Sophia, under the golden mosaics, by the light of 1,000 lamps. Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Italian, laid down their long quarrel and prayed together one final time. Priests who had refused to enter the church for months, calling it defiled, now stood at its altar. Men took communion, as if for the last time, then went back to the walls in the dark. Francis, the emperor's chancellor, watched his master weep and ask forgiveness of every man in the room. Then Constantine rode back out to the breach and took his place among the soldiers. An hour or two after midnight, on May 29, 1453, the assault began. It opened with a wall of sound, drums, trumpets, cymbals, and the great cannon firing into the dark. Tens of thousands of soldiers surged across the filled moat and up the broken walls. The first waves were the irregulars, the bashi bazouks, poorly armed men driven forward to wear down the defenders and drain their arrows. Officers with iron maces walked behind them and cut down any who turned back. They died in heaps, and their bodies filled the ditch further. Behind them came the Anatolian regulars, fresh and better armed, and once a party of them broke through in the dark, before being thrown back and killed to a man. For hours the breach became a slaughterhouse, fought hand to hand on a slope of loose stone, slick with blood, in torchlight and the flash of guns. The defenders held. Justiniani's men and the emperor's own guard threw them back twice. But there were fewer than 7,000 defenders against more than 80,000, and the arithmetic never changed. Last of all, Mehmed sent in the Janissaries, his finest, 12,000 of them advancing in silence and good order, where the others had come screaming. He watched them go from the edge of the ditch, and drove them on with his own voice. 2 blows broke the city almost at once. A party of soldiers found a small postern gate in the northern wall, the Cercoporta, left unbarred after a sortie. They slipped inside, climbed the nearest tower, and raised the Sultan's banner over the ramparts. At nearly the same moment, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Genoese commander holding the main breach, was struck through his armor by a shot and gravely wounded. He begged to be carried off to find a surgeon. Constantine pleaded with him to stay, warning that his going would break the men. He went anyway, carried down through a gate in the inner wall, and his Genoese followed him out. The defenders saw the banner flying above and their captain gone below, and the cry went up that the city was taken. Panic ran through the line. The defense wavered, then split. The Janissaries poured through the gap, a giant among them named Hassan first onto the rampart, cut down, but not before others climbed up behind him. The city was lost. Constantine saw the banners rise. He heard the panic spread. He was the heir to Augustus, to Trajan, to Justinian, the last in a line of Roman emperors reaching back 1,500 years. Ships still waited in the harbor. He could have run. He did not. He turned to the few men beside him, among them his cousin Theophilus Palaiologos and the Castilian knight Don Francisco of Toledo, and said the city was fallen and he was still alive, as if the two could not stand together. Then he threw off the purple robes and the imperial insignia, so no man could take him for a prize. He drew his sword. he was an emperor no longer. He was a soldier. He led his last men in a charge, straight into the flood of Janissaries pouring through the breach. He was swarmed and cut down and swallowed by the crowd. The last Roman emperor died without a crown, without a name anyone could later fix to his body, buried under the dead of his own guard. Later they searched the corpses for him and found, some said, a body in purple boots stitched with the double eagle, though no one could ever be sure. From that uncertainty grew a legend that the emperor did not die at all, but was turned to marble by an angel and hidden beneath the city, waiting to wake and take it back. What followed the walls was 3 days of sack. The soldiers ran through the streets by the thousands, planting banners on every tower to mark each district taken. They broke into the Hagia Sophia, where terrified crowds had gathered, believing the old prophecy that an angel would descend before the altar and drive the enemy back to the borders of Persia. No angel came. The great bronze doors were battered down. Thousands were bound together with ropes and cut belts, and led out in chains to be sold. Priests still in their vestments among them, women and children roped to their captors. Lucas Notaras, the admiral who had said he would sooner see the turban than the mitre, was taken alive. He got his wish and did not survive it. Mehmed spared him at first, then had him and his young sons executed days later when Notaras refused a demand of the Sultan. Francis lived and lost his children to slavery, and wrote it all down so we would know. Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, the Pope's man, escaped by trading his fine robes for a beggar's rags with a corpse and slipping out unrecognized. On the third day, Mehmed himself rode to the Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and poured a handful of dust over his own head, an act of humility before God, then gave the order that turned the greatest church in Christendom into a mosque. This was not a victory. It was an ending. The fall of Constantinople closed the Roman Empire for good. A flame first lit in Italy 2,000 years before, guttering out at last in the smoke over the Golden Horn. Mehmed, barely 21, took a new title, Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. He believed he had not destroyed the empire, but inherited it. He would rebuild the city, repopulate it with settlers of every faith, and make it his capital for the next 4 centuries. The fall closed the Middle Ages with it. Scholars fled west carrying Greek manuscripts that would help light the Renaissance in Italy. The old trade routes to the east slammed shut behind the new masters of the straits, and within decades, men like Columbus would sail into the open ocean, looking for another way around them. The world that woke on May 30th, 1453, was shaped by the weapon that made the conquest possible. Orban's cannon had broken more than a wall. It had broken the old rules of war. No fortress was safe now. No wall was tall enough. No tradition could stand against enough powder and bronze. Within a generation, kings across Europe were tearing down their high medieval walls and building low, thick ramparts angled to swallow a cannonball. The castle age was over. The age of gunpowder had arrived in full, an age where history would be written in explosions rather than steel. And that harder world was forged in fire, commissioned by a young sultan's hunger, and made possible by a dying emperor who could not afford the price of his own survival. Constantine kept his gold and lost his empire. Orban took the gold and lost his life. The city they fought over changed its name and its faith and its master, and the great gun that decided it all lay silent on the plain, cooling for the last time. It had cost one man a fortune he would not pay, and another man everything he was. Thank you for staying to the very end. Your viewership is the foundation of this channel. If you believe these stories from the dark heart of history deserve to be told, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and send it to someone who needs to see it. Tell us in the comments, if that cannon had never been built, would the city have held? You've just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of Roman Empire, on YouTube. Now a new story is waiting. The video appearing on your screen is your next step into the past. Click it. Walk further into the dark. We will be there when you arrive.